My name is Paul Smyers. I'm a real estate agent in the beautiful Shenandoah Valley, Virginia. And I do a lot of buyer agency and I do a lot of scouting for people. But I've sold a lot of properties in rural areas, and I want to talk a little bit about trees because trees on a property can either make a huge difference in a positive way or they can cause a lot of problems. So I want to talk a little bit about the problems and the things you got to watch out for on trees. So let's get into it a little bit. I'll talk a little bit about the positive side in a few minutes here. First of all, if you see old and falling trees on a property and you're thinking of buying it, look at where they are. If they're near your house or any structure on your property, sooner or later there's a very good chance that one of those big limbs is going to drop on your shed or something and you got a problem, you see? And it's happened many, many times to people. It can be very expensive to remove a tree, especially if it's got a 3-foot type diameter trunk. So I've known some very interesting and unfortunate and sometimes funny stories about trees on people's property, which I might get into as I talk about this. But let's talk about the cost of removal and the fact that, for example, if trees are near electric wires, now sometimes the county or the maintenance of the particular utilities on the road that you're living on, they will trim trees to a certain extent. But in rural areas, there's so many trees and so many lines going out the road that it's just sooner or later a tree might fall on a line, on a power line or something and cause a problem. So I recommend when people look for property that they look for the trees that are on the property. Are they good for you or not good for you? And I'll tell you about some of the real big advantages of having certain trees on your property in just a second here. One thing that you'll find is roots. Trees produce some massive roots that we never get to see, but they can get into septic systems, they can get into the wall of your basement, to the foundation, and that can cause some problems. So I think the general rule is make sure the trees are fairly distant from the important structures on your property, especially your house. You don't want to be up in the middle of the night and worrying about during a thunderstorm that big huge limb that you never got cut down might crash down that very day. And I've heard some very sad stories about trees on people's property. So let's get into some of the positive aspects. If you have the right trees in your property in a rural area, you might have some timber that you can sell. And if you can't sell it, if it's not easy access or there's not enough of it, you can at least have somebody come in with a portable sawmill and cut down those trees, and they will provide you and cut for you a whole bunch of your own oak or pine or whatever type of tree it is, and you can use it for building a shed or your fencing, and you can at least harvest that part of your so-called problem of trees and make a bonus out of it. So again, wind production, if you have trees on the property line and maybe there's a northwest wind that comes across the property all the time, if you have some trees strategically on your property, and the old style farmers and homesteaders did this, they would plant a pine tree, not the oaks that lose their leaves, but a pine tree like a spruce tree will block the wind all through the winter. And sometimes you can find some gorgeous, beautiful spruce trees on a property and old pines that are sitting there and they're looking gorgeous. So that's going to be a real aesthetic advantage for certain kinds of trees. Now, privacy, that also happens. If you have the right kind of privacy around you with certain kinds of trees like evergreens and so on, it makes a big difference because when people want to buy your property, let's say you're selling a property, and people come by and they go, man, there's no privacy here. Everywhere is just open. The wind rattles my porch window or whatever. So think about the advantage of certain kinds of trees and where they're situated on the property and so on. And one last thing I want to talk a little bit about is the birds and bees and any kind of flowering tree. There are some trees like fruit trees that are just absolutely gorgeous all year long. I was living on a property one time that had 12 or 15 apple trees, 2 peach trees, a pear tree, and it was just absolutely wonderful. And every single spring, it just beautiful. The bees and the birds would come. It was just absolutely gorgeous on 2.5 acres of only, imagine 15 or 20 fruit trees on a small property like that, you see. Now, it takes a long time to grow a beautiful fruit tree, and there's other kinds of trees that flower that aren't necessarily a fruit tree. In Virginia, we have a number of them. There's a catalpa tree, there's a what they call a red bud, and there's dogwoods and so on. They don't produce a fruit, but they have a beautiful, beautiful flowering nature. And that's one thing that you can buy. If you can buy a property that already has that on it, because it takes years and years to buy to grow some fruit trees. I bought some fruit trees for my property here because it didn't have any fruit trees on it when I got here. And I figured, well, let's have some peach trees and plum trees, but it's going to take a long time for them to really mature. I had some peach fruits last year, and that was really wonderful, but I have a couple little apple trees and plum trees growing, and little by little they're going to produce. But if you can find a property that already has all those beautiful fruit trees or flowering dogwood trees on it, or even forsythia bushes that produce a beautiful color in the spring, yellow, think about the advantage that you have of trees. But again, the main point of this video is to talk a bit about the trees that can be advantage or disadvantage on your property. You can make something that someone calls a disadvantage into your advantage, and there's another way you can make something that's they've let go. You can say, well, they don't like those old apple trees that are falling apart, but you trim them up and prune them and so on, and next thing you know, they're producing a lot of apples again, and it's wonderful. So to summarize here, basically trees on a property matter, especially if you're homesteading. Look around what you got there. You can find pawpaw trees that have beautiful fruit every year in this time of year in this area of the country. You can find nut trees, chestnut trees, I've seen those, hickory trees, walnuts, and so on. So think again about the trees that are on the property when you buy, and if you have any questions, I love to scout for people, and I love the comments. Tell me what you're looking for and where you're coming from, and I appreciate liking and sharing. I appreciate all the content that people share with me, the comments. I always try to respond to them. So thanks again for listening, and I hope to see you in some of my other videos. Thanks.